It was just another quiet night on Eager Street, the kind of night where Baltimore's hum fades into the distance and families retreat behind locked doors. But for 32-year-old Brianna Mitchell, a hard-working single mother of three, that calm would shatter into something unthinkable. At 10:12 p.m., she stepped through her front door carrying groceries and dreams for a better tomorrow. Minutes later, her home would become the stage of one of the most haunting crimes the city had ever seen. A brutal execution carried out by two teenagers barely old enough to drive. What could drive kids, children really, to commit such a monstrous act? Was it hatred, desperation, or something far more disturbing? The hunger for attention in an age where fame and infamy blur into one. Tonight we dive deep into the murder that shook Baltimore and the chilling psychology behind a generation willing to kill for recognition. Because this isn't just the story of a murder, it's a mirror held up to all of us. Before we begin this harrowing journey, take a second to support stories that matter. Hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon. Not for clicks, but because shedding light on tragedies like this helps ensure they're never forgotten. And if this story moves you, share it. Awareness is the first step toward change. I remember the air that night. Heavy, still, the kind of quiet that only certain neighborhoods know. The sort that doesn't mean peace, but the pause between things. On Eager Street, the lamps hummed dimly, casting fractured halos over cracked sidewalks and parked cars. In those narrow Baltimore blocks, silence isn't a luxury, it's a warning. The kind of silence that makes dogs prick up their ears and mothers double-check their locks. I've walked streets like that before, where the city feels like it's holding its breath. On the surface, it's just another night. But underneath, something is already in motion. That evening, 32-year-old Brianna Mitchell was just finishing her double shift at Mercy Medical Center. I imagine the tired weight of her steps, the faint scent of disinfectant still clinging to her scrubs, and that quiet sense of satisfaction that comes after a long day of helping others. People who knew her said she was one of those rare souls who could make exhaustion look graceful. She'd smile even when she didn't have to. That night, she packed up her things, clocked out at 9:47 p.m., and sent a quick text to her sister in Atlanta. Just finishing up, going to stop for milk and head home. A simple message, ordinary in every way. None of us ever realize when a moment like that will be our last ordinary one. Her drive home was short, 15 minutes through dim, uneven streets where the city's beauty and its heartbreak overlap. The kind of drive where you know every pothole, every corner store, every flickering street light. Around her, Baltimore was winding down. Inside row houses, TVs murmured. Radios played softly through open windows. In the Mitchell home, 3 children, Darnell, 8, Kiara, 6, and little Marcus, 4, were waiting for their mother. The cartoons had long ended, replaced by the kind of restless fidgeting that kids get when they're too tired to stay awake, but too eager to see their mom to go to bed. They didn't know that someone else was already waiting in that house, too. You see, when people talk about evil, they like to imagine it looks like something. A monster, a mask, something you'd recognize. But that night, evil wore sneakers and hoodies. It had teenage hands and nervous laughter. It came in through a broken window in the back of the house about half an hour before Brianna got home. 2 boys, 16-year-old Ethan Wilson and 17-year-old Malik Thompson. They didn't know her. They didn't know her kids. She was just a name they'd never heard, a door that wasn't theirs. The reports say they tested windows, whispered to each other, maybe even joked a little. There was nothing desperate about it. Nothing that spoke of survival or necessity. What they were doing was something else, something colder. Later, investigators would piece it together. How the boys crept through the kitchen, how they found the kids sitting on the couch, how they told them to stay quiet. There was no shouting, no rage, just this eerie stillness, like they were waiting for something. The oldest boy, Darnell, would later tell police that one of them kept checking his phone. They said they were waiting for someone special. he said. That line stayed with me. Someone special. As if what they were about to do had meaning. As if the cruelty could be justified by its performance. At 10:11 p.m., a neighbor's camera caught Brianna parking her car. You can almost see her moving quickly, carrying grocery bags up the steps, her key in the door. It's a fleeting, human moment, one that should have led to nothing more than bedtime stories and goodnight kisses. But when she opened that door, everything ordinary about her life unraveled in seconds. There's a point in every tragedy where reality splits, before and after. That doorway was her divide. I often wonder what she thought when she saw them. 2 kids, boys really, standing in her living room, her babies lined up on the couch behind them. Did she think it was a robbery? Did she try to reason with them? She'd worked in healthcare. She'd seen fear before, seen what panic could do. Maybe she raised her hands. Maybe she spoke softly, hoping to de-escalate. The reports say she didn't fight. There were no overturned chairs, no shattered glass, just stillness, compliance, the quiet bravery of a mother who would do anything to keep her children alive. Outside, no one noticed. Gunshots in East Baltimore aren't rare enough to sound the alarm. It took almost 20 minutes before the first call reached 911, but it didn't come from a neighbor. It came from her son, 8-year-old Darnell. He called from his mother's phone, his voice trembling but steady. "My mom is bleeding," he told the dispatcher. "The bad boys shot her. We need help, please." The dispatcher's notes say his tone was unnaturally calm, a calmness born of shock. When she asked if the bad boys were still there, he said no. They left. They said they got what they wanted. They said we should remember their faces. When first responders arrived, they found the children huddled around their mother. The youngest, Marcus, was still pressing a towel against one of her wounds, like he'd seen his mom do for patients at the hospital. He didn't understand that she was already gone. Officers who were there that night said it's something they'll never forget. The sight of those kids trying to wake their mother up. There are moments in policing that never leave you, no matter how many years pass. For the officers who entered that small row house on Eager Street, this was one of them. They secured the scene, called for detectives, and began piecing together the fragments of what had just happened. 7 shell casings, 2 sets of bloody footprints, a window forced open, small handprints in a mother's blood. Forensic details tell one story, but emotion tells another. I can picture the walls, the quiet hum of a house that had once been full of warmth, now thick with the silence of trauma. There's something sacred about a family home. It absorbs laughter, arguments, love. But that night, it absorbed something far darker. The neighborhood didn't react immediately. It rarely does. In communities where violence has become a cruel rhythm, tragedy doesn't always sound like alarm bells. Sometimes it's just another verse in an endless song. But when word spread about what had happened, something shifted. It wasn't just another murder. This one hit different. A mother killed in front of her children? That's not just violence, that's desecration. Even in a city hardened by loss, people felt this one. It broke through the numbness. The media would arrive later with their microphones and urgency, calling it a senseless act. But I've always hated that phrase. Senseless suggests there was nothing to understand. But there's always a reason, twisted as it might be. Somewhere behind those bullets was intention. Somewhere in those teenagers' minds was a purpose. Warped by ego, poisoned by culture, but still deliberate. It's what made this story so haunting. They didn't kill out of rage, they killed for recognition. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Brianna's killers had been chasing something. Not money, not revenge, but attention. A social media challenge. A cruel viral dare to commit the most unforgettable act in their neighborhood. And they did. They wanted to be remembered, and in that sick irony, they got exactly what they wanted, at the cost of everything. But that night, none of that was known yet. All anyone could see was a mother gone and 3 children whose lives would never be the same. I imagined the detective standing outside the Mitchell home as dawn broke, the first light spilling over yellow tape, the city waking up to headlines about another homicide, another statistic. But to those who had been inside that living room, this wasn't just another case file. It was personal. When you work long enough in cities like Baltimore, you learn to separate your heart from your job, to process the horror, catalog the evidence, move on. But some scenes cling to you. They settle somewhere behind your ribs, where you keep the memories that don't fade. Officer Regina Collins, one of the first on the scene, would later say, "I've seen a lot in this city, but that one broke me." She wasn't talking about the blood. She was talking about the children, about the way Kiara had been singing to her mother when they found them, softly, like a lullaby, trying to bring her back. By the next morning, detectives were already reviewing security footage, canvassing neighbors, building a timeline. But I keep coming back to those last moments. The way the night swallowed the sound of gunfire, the way no one came until a child called for help. It's haunting how tragedy can unfold in plain sight, and the world just keeps spinning. Every story like this carries 2 clocks, the one that tracks the crime and the one that tracks the aftermath. The first ends in seconds. The second never does. For Brianna's children, that clock will keep ticking for the rest of their lives. Every bedtime without her. Every milestone she should have been there for. The echoes of that night will stretch across years, carried in their memories like shadows that never quite fade. Sometimes when I think about this story, I picture Brianna's last moments not in fear, but in defiance. Not screaming, but doing what mothers do, protecting. Maybe she looked at her children one last time and told them to be brave. Maybe she said nothing at all because she knew they needed quiet more than words. We'll never really know. But what I do know is that even in her final moments, she stood between innocence and cruelty. That's the kind of strength that doesn't die, even when the body does. That night on Eager Street began like any other, with grocery bags, tired feet, and the promise of rest. But by the time the sun rose, it had become a story the city would never forget. A story not just about death, but about what drives people, even children, to destroy something so pure. And as the police lights dimmed and the neighborhood fell silent again, the real investigation was only beginning. The city wanted answers. The nation would soon demand them. And what detectives uncovered in the days that followed would expose something far darker than a random act of violence. Because the truth behind that night wasn't random at all. It was recorded, planned, celebrated. And somewhere in that digital void, when among the messages, videos, and twisted motivations, lay the disturbing reason why 2 teenagers decided that infamy was worth a mother's life. When a story like this reaches the news, the first thing most people see is the headline, a few cold words that flatten a life into tragedy. Mother of 3 killed in home invasion. That's all it takes for a stranger to form an image and move on. But if you ever stood in Brianna Mitchell's kitchen, if you'd seen the children's drawings taped to the refrigerator, the worn storybooks stacked beside the sofa, the folded nursing scrubs hanging by the door, you'd understand that no headline could ever hold who she really was. I've spent months piecing together fragments of her world, and every conversation with someone who loved her paints the same picture. A woman who carried too much, gave too much, and somehow smiled through it anyway. Brianna grew up just a few miles from where she died, in a narrow brick row house on a street that never quite decided whether it wanted to recover or give up. Her mother cleaned hospital floors. Her father drove city buses until an injury forced him into early retirement. Their neighborhood was the kind of place that could feel like 2 cities pressed together, hope on one block, despair on the next. Kids learned early how to read the rhythm of sirens and when to come inside. Yet inside the Mitchell home there was warmth, the smell of Sunday dinners, the echo of her father's radio playing old soul songs. Brianna learned that love doesn't need luxury, it just needs persistence. She was a bright student, quiet but driven, the kind who took notes in colored pens and dreamed of wearing a nurse's badge someday. Her teachers still remember the essay she wrote about healing the world, one patient at a time. Life, of course, had its own timetable. She became a mother at 19, and the college brochures were pushed aside for diapers and night shifts. But she didn't quit dreaming. She just remapped the route. "My babies will come to my graduation one day," she once told a friend. People who knew her still repeat that line because it captured the mix of realism and hope that defined her. The world Brianna navigated was unforgiving. Baltimore's East Side, like so many American neighborhoods built on red lines and broken promises, demanded endurance. Rent rose faster than wages. Child care costs devoured paychecks. And still, every morning, she laced up her sneakers and walked to the daycare where she worked with other people's children before heading to the hospital to care for the city's sick and elderly. She was the kind of worker society depends on but rarely notices, the invisible backbone of compassion. Her co-workers remember her humming softly while stocking supplies, the way she'd stay an extra 10 minutes with frightened patients even when her shift had technically ended. At home, exhaustion turned into small acts of devotion. Pancake mornings, homework spread across the kitchen table, movie nights where she fell asleep halfway through but pretended she hadn't. The children, Darnell, Kiara, and little Marcus, were her whole universe. Every picture she posted online centered on them. Birthday cakes made from boxed mix but decorated with love. Halloween costumes sewn from thrift store fabric. Smiling faces in front of a house she'd bought through a first-time homebuyer program. She told friends owning that house meant her kids would finally have something that's ours. That dream, modest and monumental at the same time, became her measure of success. Whenever I walk those streets now, I can still feel what she must have felt. Pride mixed with exhaustion, fear braided with determination. The neighborhood around Eager Street had changed. Some houses boarded, others freshly painted, hope and decay side by side. The people who live there will tell you they stay because it's home, because leaving feels like surrender. Brianna was one of them. She didn't want to run from her city. She wanted to help fix it, to show her kids that good could grow even in hard soil. But beneath that hope ran quieter currents, currents that would one day collide with her life. The schools her children attended were underfunded. The playground down the block had broken swings and no lights. Across town, social media trends were shaping a new kind of desperation among teenagers hungry to be seen. It's easy now to draw the lines backward, to trace how systemic neglect breeds loneliness. And loneliness can twist into something darker. Back then, though, those patterns were invisible. Brianna couldn't have known that the same city failing to protect her dreams was also failing the boys who would later destroy them. Her friends describe her as the dependable one. She was the person who remembered birthdays, who lent grocery money she didn't really have, who called her elderly neighbor every evening just to check in. She had this habit of apologizing when she couldn't help more, one co-worker told me, as if doing everything she already did wasn't enough. That's the kind of heart she had, one that never learned how to rest. When the news of her death broke, people in her orbit refused to believe it at first. "Not Brianna," they said, as though goodness itself should grant immunity. At the daycare, someone taped her photo to the sign-in desk, surrounded by children's crayon hearts. At the hospital, nurses left flowers in the break room and stories on scraps of paper, little memories of laughter during long shifts. The neighborhood held a candlelight vigil. The turnout stretched down the block. Strangers wept for a woman they only knew through headlines, because in her story they recognized something universal, the daily fight to build a life out of very little. And yet, as the vigils faded and the reporters moved on, deeper questions lingered. How could a city so dependent on people like Brianna fail to keep them safe? How could children barely past childhood themselves become the instruments of such destruction? The easy answers, bad kids, bad neighborhoods, never tell the truth. The truth lives in layers, in underfunded schools, in broken community programs, in the slow erosion of empathy when people stop believing they matter. Brianna's life was the evidence of what perseverance looks like. The boys' lives were evidence of what neglect creates. Sometimes, while recording this documentary, I catch myself staring at her photo longer than the script requires. She's smiling in her nursing uniform, eyes bright, posture proud. It's an ordinary picture, but the kind that seems to speak. Remember me as more than what happened to me. And that's what this chapter is for, to give her that. To remind anyone watching that before the sirens, before the headlines, there was a woman who woke early, worked hard, loved fiercely, and believed tomorrow could still be better. As we move forward, we'll see how the investigation unfolds, how the city responds, and how justice is sought. But it's important to carry Brianna's story with us, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a portrait of the millions of women like her who keep cities running quietly, whose labor holds the world together until the moment it breaks. Because behind every headline, there's always a heartbeat, and hers deserves to be remembered first. The first thing people imagine when they hear the words crime scene is chaos, sirens, flashing lights, crowds pressing in. But that isn't how it feels from inside the tape. Inside, it's strangely quiet. The air goes still, and every sound, the click of a camera, the rustle of a notepad, feels louder than it should. I've stood near places like that, and the stillness always carries the same weight, the sense that time itself has decided to stop and wait for someone to explain what just happened. When investigators arrived at the Mitchell home, that same stillness met them. The officers who had responded first had already cleared the house, checked the rooms, made sure no one else was inside. Now the detectives moved slowly through the narrow hallway, eyes tracing every surface, hearts balancing the distance between duty and compassion. A scene like this is never just a location. It's a story frozen in place, waiting to be read without breaking anything sacred. They work in pairs for a reason, one to see, the other to remember. The notes they take that night will become evidence, but the things they feel, those stay unfiled. Outside, the neighborhood was beginning to stir. Word travels faster than any patrol car. People gathered on porches, whispering names, trying to make sense of why the street they walked every day was suddenly glowing in police light. Some stayed out of curiosity, some out of fear, some because leaving would feel like admitting they lived in a place where this could happen. The hum of police radios mixed with the low murmur of neighbors praying under their breath. You could sense the tension between sorrow and survival, the unspoken rule of city life that says, mourn, but don't linger too long. Inside the command van, parked nearby, a whiteboard filled with names, timestamps, addresses, arrows connecting questions that didn't yet have answers. Detectives worked the timeline like a puzzle, fitting fragments together. The shift Brianna finished, the store receipt found in her car, the call to 911. Every new piece added depth, but also raised a harder question. Why? In homicide work, the who usually comes first. The why is what keeps investigators awake long after the paperwork ends. Forensics technicians moved through the house with careful precision, preserving more than evidence. They were preserving dignity. Each item they cataloged wasn't just part of a case file, it was part of a life. There's a quiet ritual to their work, gloves changed often, photographs taken from multiple angles, whispered confirmations between partners. To outsiders, it might seem clinical, but beneath that procedure lies respect. Everyone in that house knew they were walking through someone's story, not just a crime. Later that night, After the last unit cleared the scene, one of the senior detectives lingered outside. He looked up and down Eager Street, then toward the hospital just visible over the rooftops where Brianna had spent her nights caring for others. He didn't say much, most detectives don't, but someone later recalled him whispering, "We owe her the truth." Those words would become the quiet mission statement for the team. In the following days, the investigation grew outward like ripples in water. Surveillance footage was requested from corner stores. Neighbors were re-interviewed. Phone records and traffic cameras were reviewed. Each lead carried the hope of clarity. But for every new piece of information, there were two more questions. Baltimore is a city layered in complexity. Block by block, it can feel like different worlds stitched together. The detectives understood that finding answers here required more than technical skill. It demanded empathy, cultural fluency, patience. Meanwhile, community leaders and pastors began visiting the family. They weren't part of the investigation, but they were part of the healing. One local minister described the scene to me weeks later. "There was so much silence in that house. We just sat with the kids and let them breathe." In the aftermath of tragedy, that kind of stillness can be its own form of medicine. When I interviewed one of the evidence technicians months later, she said something that stayed with me. "You learn to separate what you see from who you are, but sometimes the separation cracks." For her, this case cracked it. She spoke about walking into rooms that feel frozen mid-sentence, about objects that still hold the temperature of the moment before everything changed. Listening to her reminded me that for every statistic we read, there are people who carry the invisible weight of documenting it. As the days passed, the crime scene itself transformed from a location into a memory. The tape came down, the house was cleaned, and life on Eager Street resumed its rhythm. But under the fresh paint and repaired windows, the memory of that night remained. Residents began leaving flowers at the steps, candles that burned out overnight but were replaced each evening. Those small rituals became the neighborhood's way of reclaiming space, of saying that what happened here would not define them, even if it scarred them. The police department held a short press conference that week. Standing behind the podium, the chief spoke carefully, aware of the cameras, aware of the community's exhaustion. He promised swift justice, but he also acknowledged something deeper. "We can't keep asking our people to live between fear and faith." For once, the microphones caught a sentence that sounded less like protocol and more like grief. Investigations like this one are marathons disguised as sprints. Each piece of evidence leads to another lead. Every interview opens another path. Detectives begin to live inside the timeline, memorizing the victim's final day until it feels almost like their own. I've spoken to enough of them to know that what drives them isn't just solving a case. It's restoring order to a world that feels momentarily senseless. By the end of the first week, the team had a clearer picture of what had happened and a direction to move in. But even as the investigation began to point toward the suspects, the larger story was already unfolding. The community grappling with fear, the media circling, the children beginning therapy, and a city once again facing itself in the mirror. That reflection, the one that shows both beauty and brokenness, is the hardest to look at. As I stood on Eager Street some months later, the summer heat rising off the pavement, the house looked ordinary again. New curtains, a freshly painted door, laughter from children down the block. But if you linger long enough, you can still feel the echo of that night. Not in the walls, but in the way people glance at the house, quick and respectful, as though passing a memorial. Tragedy leaves that kind of presence. It becomes part of the neighborhood's vocabulary, quietly shaping how people speak, move, and hope. The investigation would soon uncover the truth behind those echoes. The evidence gathered in that small home would connect to names, faces, and choices made by teenagers trying to matter in a world that too often ignores them. But before any arrests were made, the detectives and the community shared a brief, fragile understanding. Justice was coming, but it would never feel like enough. And that's the paradox of a crime scene. It's where a story ends and where another one begins. The story of everyone left behind trying to rebuild meaning out of fragments. When the first week passed without an arrest, the air in Baltimore seemed to grow heavier. People were talking, at bus stops, in break rooms, in corner stores. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had heard something. In neighborhoods like this, information moves differently. It doesn't follow the neat path of official reports. It drifts through whispered conversations, traded like currency between people who know the streets better than any detective ever could. I remember walking past a row of barbershops where men sat in silence, shaking their heads at the news playing on the small TV near the counter. There was grief in that silence, but also anger, the quiet kind that builds into something immovable. Inside the precinct, detectives were living on caffeine and adrenaline. Homicide investigations are never tidy. They're a mix of logic and intuition, 1,000 small tasks orbiting around one single purpose, to restore sense to the senseless. Every detail from the crime scene was being examined, cross-checked, logged into databases. But this case felt different. It wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about protecting the children who had seen it happen and a community that had already lost too much. The lead detective, a seasoned veteran named Howard Jameson, had seen his share of horrors, but this one had settled in his chest differently. He told me later that what drove him wasn't vengeance. It was the look in those children's eyes when he met them. They'd already seen the worst thing a person can see, he said, so our job wasn't just to find the killers, it was to prove that the world still had order in it. The first breakthrough came from technology, the same technology that, ironically, had inspired the suspect's warped desire for attention. Surveillance cameras had caught glimpses of movement on nearby streets, a few blurred figures, flashes of sneakers, hooded silhouettes. Individually, the images were meaningless. Together, they formed a pattern, and patterns are what investigators live for. Every new angle added a piece to the puzzle. A timestamp here, a car's reflection there, the direction of a glance. Slowly, they began reconstructing the invisible map of that night. While the tech analysts worked, the detectives went door to door. They knocked on neighbors' doors, not just for witness statements, but for understanding. Sometimes people opened up, sometimes they didn't. Fear has a way of silencing whole blocks. In communities where cooperation with police can carry risks, silence is often a survival strategy. But even then, people find ways to speak. A folded note slipped to an officer, a phone call made after dark, an anonymous message through a friend of a friend. Bit by bit, the city began to talk. One of the detectives described the process to me like fishing in murky water. You can't see what's down there, but you feel the line tighten. Every lead they pulled on revealed another thread. The investigation stretched from East Baltimore to the surrounding suburbs, from schools to social media accounts. And somewhere in that digital maze, they began to see names appear, teenagers with online personas built on bravado, danger, and desperate performance. But the detectives also saw something else, the cultural machinery that made those performances possible. Scrolling through the posts, they found comments cheering violence, daring others to go viral, to prove how fearless they were. It was heartbreaking and infuriating. These weren't hardened criminals. They were kids chasing relevance in a world that rewarded shock more than substance. I remember one officer saying, "They didn't even want money. They wanted a moment." That line stayed with me because it said everything about the times we live in. As the investigation deepened, the media turned the case into nightly spectacle. Headlines, debates, pundits pointing fingers at schools, parents, the justice system. But while the city argued about blame, the detectives were quietly tightening their net. Search warrants were issued for phone data, online profiles, and local hangouts. Piece by piece, they traced patterns of communication, finding links that pointed to two young suspects who seemed inseparable both online and off. When the team gathered to review the evidence, the room fell silent. Photos of the suspects, two teenagers barely out of childhood, sat side by side on the screen. They didn't look like monsters. They looked like kids you'd see waiting for the bus, earbuds in, hoodies up, eyes half defiant, half lost. That's what made it so hard to process. The detectives had expected rage or hatred as the motive, but what they found instead was emptiness, an emotional void filled by screens and spectatorship. That discovery shifted the tone of the entire hunt. What had started as a chase for killers became a reckoning with a broken culture. The detectives weren't just chasing two names anymore. They were staring into the reflection of a generation raised under the gaze of social media's indifferent camera. Some of them had kids of their own, and that realization cut deep. Outside the precinct, the community was doing its own kind of hunting, searching for meaning. Local pastors held forums, youth counselors visited schools, parents hugged their children tighter. The tragedy had forced everyone to ask uncomfortable questions. How did we get here? What are we teaching our children about worth, about being seen, about what it means to matter? Back in the investigation room, the breakthrough moment came late one night. A data analyst noticed a pattern in one suspect's online activity, a series of posts that matched the timeline of the crime almost minute for minute. It was enough to secure warrants. The next 48 hours would change everything. Planning arrests in cases like this is meticulous. It isn't about drama or danger, it's about control. The goal is always the same: no surprises, no chaos. The detectives met in the early hours of the morning, their briefing quiet and focused. Maps unfolded, addresses circled, roles assigned. Outside, the city slept, unaware that justice was already on its way. When dawn broke over Baltimore, the air was cool and still. Police vehicles moved through the streets with their lights off, engines low. The teams positioned themselves with practiced precision. There were no movie-style chases, no shouted commands through megaphones. Just a knock, a door opening, and the slow, methodical rhythm of duty. Within minutes, the two teenagers were in custody. That morning, the city woke to headlines announcing the arrests. Relief rippled through the community, but it was a quiet kind of relief, tempered by sadness. Because even though justice had arrived, it carried no victory. Two young lives had been lost in different ways, one to violence, two to the consequences of it. People lit candles again that night, this time not just for Brianna, but for the brokenness that had claimed everyone involved. For the detectives, the hunt was over. But as one of them told me later, catching them doesn't mean closure. It just means the questions get harder. Those questions, about upbringing, technology, isolation, and accountability, would soon move from the precinct into the courtroom. And that's where the story would take its next turn, as a city already stretched thin tried to make sense of how justice should look when everyone involved is still so young. And that's where we'll go next. Into the courtroom, into the city's conscience, and into the uncomfortable space between punishment and understanding. Because sometimes the hardest hunt of all isn't for the suspects, it's for the truth about ourselves. The morning after the arrests, the city exhaled, a long, uneven breath that carried both relief and disbelief. On paper, the case was solved. The suspects were in custody. The system had done its job. But standing outside the precinct that day, I remember thinking, did we really understand anything yet? Because behind those mug shots were faces far too young to belong in headlines like these. The real question wasn't who did it. It was how did they become capable of it? When the detectives finally sat down to piece together the suspects' backgrounds, the story that emerged wasn't one of pure evil, it was one of erosion, the slow, grinding kind that happens when poverty, neglect, and disconnection wear away at a child's sense of value. These boys, let's call them E and M, had grown up only a few miles from Brianna Mitchell, yet they'd lived in a completely different Baltimore. Where she saw work as salvation, they saw it as futility. Where she believed in rules, they believed in survival. Their world was built on a simple, brutal equation: be noticed or disappear. Every file on their upbringing read like a cautionary tale written too late. Absent fathers. Schools that cycled teachers faster than textbooks. Food insecurity. Evictions. You could trace each failure back through a chain of other failures until it no longer looked like two individuals making bad choices, but a system producing them. Still, that explanation, while true, never feels like enough. There's always that missing piece, the moment where a person decides to stop caring about consequence. Social workers had crossed paths with them. Guidance counselors had tried to steer them toward programs. But programs need funding, mentors need time, and both are scarce commodities in cities stretched thin. When the digital age arrived, it gave these kids something they'd never had before: an audience. For a generation raised on screens, being unseen was the ultimate failure. The boys began posting videos, street pranks, petty thefts, stunts that flirted with danger. Likes became validation, views became currency. Each small rush of attention hardened into identity. Scrolling through those old posts later, I couldn't help but feel the chilling contrast between the laughter on screen and the tragedy it would eventually lead to. There's something profoundly sad about watching young people try to perform toughness because they've never been allowed to feel safe. Psychologists call it performative masculinity. I call it armor made of noise. When the detectives mapped out their digital footprints, a clearer picture emerged. The boys weren't masterminds. They were echo chambers of a culture that rewards spectacle. They followed influencers who glorified recklessness, who preached that being feared was the same as being respected. In their world, empathy was weakness. Compassion got you mocked. The internet didn't invent that mindset, it just amplified it, feeding it back until it sounded like truth. What struck me most was how ordinary their days looked outside that online persona. Teachers described quiet kids. Neighbors remembered polite greetings. Somewhere between those small courtesies and the violent performance online was the gap where identity fractured. They had grown up in an environment where violence was common enough to feel normal and attention rare enough to feel like oxygen. And when you combine desensitization with desperation, you get volatility. The detectives began interviewing classmates, relatives, anyone who might explain the mindset that had led to the crime. Most people said the same thing. They were surprised but not shocked. That difference, the space between surprise and inevitability, is where so many American tragedies live. People sense the tension long before it snaps. They see the warning signs, the isolation, the obsession with notoriety, the absence of positive models. But knowing is not the same as preventing. When I spoke with a youth counselor who had once worked in their school district, she sighed before answering my first question. "Everyone wants to blame the kids," she said, "but no one wants to talk about the ecosystem that raises them." She described classrooms without enough books, after-school centers closing early, neighborhoods where trauma is inherited like property. We keep expecting empathy to grow in places where it's never been planted. Her words were blunt, but she wasn't excusing anything. She was naming the soil that grows the weeds. As the city learned more about the suspects, public conversation split in two directions. Some called for harsh punishment, an example to be made. Others pleaded for understanding, for an approach that treated these boys as symptoms of deeper wounds. The debate wasn't new. It flares up every time a violent act shocks the conscience. But this case made it impossible to ignore the contradiction of a society that both condemns and neglects its youth in the same breath. For me, the most haunting part wasn't the violence itself. It was the void it revealed. A void where mentorship should have been, where empathy should have been taught, where the simple affirmation of being seen could have changed everything. These kids weren't born cruel, they were born curious like everyone else. Somewhere along the way, curiosity curdled into cynicism. Psychologists who later studied the case found that their online interactions followed a recognizable pattern. Each escalation of behavior was rewarded with attention, which conditioned them to push boundaries further. Its behaviorism played out in pixels. The more outrageous the act, the larger the audience. In that echo chamber, morality isn't erased, it's irrelevant. When the screen becomes your mirror, you start measuring worth in reactions rather than reflection. It's tempting to see stories like this as warnings about technology, but technology is only the amplifier. The real tragedy lies in the absence of belonging. Both suspects came from fractured homes where adults were too busy surviving to supervise. In communities where resources are scarce, time becomes a privilege. Parents work double shifts, siblings raise siblings, and the streets or the internet fill in the gaps. The boys had found a tribe online, one that celebrated chaos and called it courage. When the news showed their photos, I remember how people reacted. Some saw monsters, others saw lost boys. I saw both, and that's the hardest truth to accept. We crave clear villains because they make moral arithmetic simple. But life rarely gives us that clarity. It gives us children raised without safety nets, making catastrophic choices in a world that taught them attention is survival. The detectives, for all their professionalism, wrestled with that same conflict. They wanted justice for Brianna and her children, but they also couldn't ignore the sadness of watching teenagers in handcuffs, their futures evaporating before they'd even had one. You look at them and think, "This didn't have to happen," one officer told me. "Not for her, not for them, not for anyone." In the weeks that followed, the case file grew thicker, filled with reports, psychological evaluations, transcripts. But beneath the bureaucracy was a quiet lesson that echoed through the department. Prevention doesn't start with policing. It starts with presence. With mentors, teachers, community members showing up before the damage begins. Because by the time detectives get involved, it's already too late for everyone. When I think back on this chapter of the story, I see it less as an unmasking and more as an unveiling. A confrontation with the parts of society we prefer not to see. We want our monsters to be foreign, our tragedies to be random, our innocence to be uncomplicated. But the truth sitting at the heart of this case is that violence doesn't appear from nowhere. It grows in the cracks we ignore, watered by loneliness and the algorithms that exploit it. The unmasking, then, isn't just about the perpetrators. It's about us, the adults, the institutions, the culture that shapes young minds and then acts surprised when they reflect its fractures. That realization is uncomfortable, but necessary. Because until we name the shadows we've created, they'll keep returning in new forms, new faces, new tragedies. And so, as the legal machinery prepared to turn, as court dates were set and prosecutors gathered evidence, the detectives closed their notebooks and the city turned its gaze toward the courthouse. The hunt was over. But the reckoning, the one that would test not just the justice system but the collective conscience of a community, was only beginning. Whenever people hear about crimes like this, the first question they ask is always why. It's the question that haunts every investigator, every journalist, every parent watching from home. We want evil to make sense, to have a pattern, a root, a logic we can trace. But when the suspects are barely out of childhood, that question becomes even heavier. Because what you're really asking isn't why did they do it, but how did we lose them before they ever had a chance to be found? I sat down with a psychologist who had been brought in to evaluate the two boys after their arrest. Her office was quiet, sunlit, filled with books about adolescent development and trauma theory. She'd been studying youth violence for 20 years, and yet she admitted that every case still surprised her. "People think anger is born in an instant," she said. "But it's not. It's layered. Most of the time, what looks like rage is just pain that's never been named." She talked about the way trauma rewires young minds, not just through direct abuse, but through chronic instability. A child doesn't need to be beaten to be broken. Constant fear, unpredictable environments, and the invisible weight of poverty can train the brain to live in survival mode. In that state, empathy starts to dim. It's not that it disappears. It's that the nervous system no longer recognizes safety long enough to sustain it. You can't teach compassion to someone who's still trying to convince themselves they're not prey, she said quietly. That sentence stayed with me for days. The more I learned, the more I realized that these boys weren't anomalies. They were reflections of patterns visible in countless cities across the country. You could change the names, the neighborhoods, even the specifics of the crime, and the themes would echo the same. Fatherlessness, poverty, overstressed schools, digital influence, untreated trauma. It's not an excuse. It's an ecosystem. And ecosystems, once poisoned, tend to reproduce their toxins unless someone intervenes. When I reviewed the reports of their psychological assessments, what stood out wasn't hatred or psychopathy. It was emptiness. Both boys showed high levels of desensitization to violence, something psychologists now call emotional numbing. It happens when young people are repeatedly exposed to conflict, either in real life or through media, until their threshold for empathy is dulled. Violence becomes entertainment. Suffering becomes background noise. The world starts to look like a game board where the only goal is survival. I asked the psychologist if rehabilitation was possible. She leaned back in her chair, thinking carefully before answering. Possible? Yes. Common? No. Because rehabilitation isn't about punishment, it's about presence. These boys needed consistent, stable adults years before they ever needed a judge. By the time we meet them, the damage has already calcified. Then she smiled faintly. But I've seen it happen. I've seen kids come back from the edge. It just takes time, patience, and someone who refuses to give up on them. Her words made me think of all the people who had already given up. Not just on these two, but on so many like them. It's a collective surrender that happens quietly, one missed opportunity at a time. The teacher, too exhausted to check in. The neighbor, too scared to intervene. The policymaker, too distracted to notice. The line between responsibility and indifference gets blurry when survival is the only priority. But in that blur, empathy dies. And when empathy dies, so does accountability. Inside their minds, according to the evaluations, was a distorted equation of power. To them, power meant control. Control over their image, their environment, their fear. When you've grown up powerless, the smallest sense of control feels intoxicating. And when that control comes from provoking others or from being watched, it becomes addictive. It's a psychology shaped not by malice, but by hunger, the hunger to be seen. The psychologist called it identity through reaction. In a digital world, many young people no longer form their identities through relationships. They form them through responses. How many likes, how many shares, how many people are watching. For those who grow up without affirmation, that becomes a lifeline. But like any drug, it requires constant escalation. Eventually, even shock loses its thrill, and they start chasing bigger reactions, riskier behavior, darker fantasies of recognition. By the time someone steps in, the line between performance and reality has blurred beyond repair. I visited a youth rehabilitation center months later, not the one where the suspects were held, but a similar facility. Inside were boys the same age, some convicted of robbery, some of assault. Their stories sounded painfully familiar. Absent parents, digital addiction, constant stress. One of them told me something that still echoes in my mind. No one ever asked me what I was good at. They only told me what I did wrong. That single sentence, delivered with a shrug, held the tragedy of an entire generation. What happens inside the mind of a young person when their only mirror is a world that expects their failure? It bends. It warps. They begin to believe that destruction is the only way to announce their existence. That's the psychology of despair, the illusion that chaos equals meaning. And yet, underneath even that, there's always the faint pulse of humanity. Faint, but there. The part that could still recognize beauty, if only someone showed it to them. The detectives working the case often talked about that paradox. They hated what the boys had done, but they couldn't hate them completely. When I looked at them, I saw my own kids. One officer admitted, same shoes, same slang, same dreams twisted inside out. He paused. It makes you wonder how thin that line really is, between the ones who find guidance and the ones who don't. That's the kind of reflection you never hear in press conferences, but it's what lingers in private moments when the cameras are gone. This chapter of the story isn't about forgiveness. It's about understanding. Because understanding is the only soil where prevention can grow. When we see these tragedies only as aberrations, we miss the opportunity to learn from them. But when we're brave enough to look deeper, to trace the path of pain, to acknowledge the structures that shaped it, we start to see the patterns that can be interrupted. The goal isn't to justify, but to humanize. Because the moment we strip humanity away, even from the broken, we risk losing our own. In the end, what I took away from the psychologists, detectives, and social workers who worked on this case is simple. Violence doesn't begin with a weapon. It begins with disconnection. A child who feels unseen will do almost anything to be noticed. A mind that's never been taught empathy will imitate strength through domination. A society that doesn't teach emotional literacy ends up raising generations fluent in pain but illiterate in healing. If there's any hope buried in this tragedy, it's that recognition. The awareness that inside the minds of those who harm lies the same longing that lives in all of us, to be understood, to matter, to belong. The difference is where and how that longing finds expression. For Brianna, it was love. For these boys, it became destruction. Two sides of the same human need, shaped by entirely different worlds. And as the trial approached, that realization weighed heavily on everyone involved. Because the court could deliver justice, but it couldn't deliver redemption. That's something far more complex, something that has to begin long before any crime is committed, something that has to begin inside the mind. The morning the arrests were made, the city didn't know yet. There were no sirens echoing through the streets, no flashing lights slicing through windows. Just a quiet, gray dawn over Baltimore, cold, still, almost deceptively peaceful. From the outside, it looked like any other morning. But inside the precinct, there was a different kind of silence. It was the silence that settles before something inevitable. The detectives moved with a practiced calm, their faces drawn from long nights and heavier hearts. They weren't celebrating. They were steady, focused, aware of the weight of what they were about to do. In the days leading up to that morning, the department had been running on momentum and exhaustion. They had their suspects, their warrants, and their plan. But what weighed on everyone wasn't the procedure. It was the realization that the people they were about to arrest were still just kids. "They've got baby faces," one officer told me later, shaking his head. "You look at them, and you don't see killers. You see confusion." That tension, the clash between duty and empathy, hung in the air like humidity. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. I've spoken to several detectives about that day, and they all described the same feeling. Relief laced with sorrow. Relief that the case was nearing resolution. Sorrow that justice would have to mean loss again. You can't undo tragedy with another tragedy. And yet that's often what justice requires. Balance. Even when the scales themselves are broken. "You don't win," said one of the lead investigators. "You just stop the bleeding." That phrase echoed in my mind long after the interviews were done. By mid-morning, the word had spread quietly among officers, journalists, and community leaders. The suspects were in custody. The confirmation came not with fanfare, but with a press release so brief it almost felt inadequate. 2 juveniles arrested in connection with the murder of Brianna Mitchell, That's all it said. 2 lines of text to mark the end of weeks of agony and the beginning of another chapter of reckoning. When the news reached the neighborhood, the reaction was immediate but divided. Some residents cried tears of relief. Others just stood on their porches, arms crossed, faces unreadable. In communities accustomed to tragedy, justice feels complicated. It doesn't heal, it just settles. "I'm glad they caught them," one woman told a reporter. "But tell me what that changes for those kids who saw it." Her words cut through the noise like truth often does. Clear, painful, unanswerable. At the hospital where Brianna had worked, word spread fast. Colleagues paused in the hallways, phones in hand, their faces caught between closure and disbelief. "We wanted justice," one nurse said, "but I didn't think it would feel this heavy." The break room that day was quieter than usual. Someone left a candle burning beside her photo, the wax pooling slowly over the counter. Small gestures like that, simple, human, become the language of mourning when words no longer suffice. Meanwhile, the children were being shielded from the storm. Family members and counselors worked together to keep the outside world at bay. But even young hearts can sense when something shifts. Darnell, the oldest, had asked weeks earlier if the bad boys would ever be caught. When he was told they had been, he didn't say anything for a while. Then, according to a family friend, he simply nodded and whispered, "Good." It wasn't triumph. It was the quiet understanding that the story had moved one step closer to ending, even if peace was still far away. In the city's media circles, the arrests reignited debate. Talk shows dissected the case, asking the same moral questions that echo through every story like this. How do children become capable of such acts? Who is to blame? What should justice look like when youth is part of the crime? The conversations were loud, emotional, sometimes divisive. But underneath all the noise was a quieter, more personal reckoning. Parents were looking at their own children differently that week, checking in more, asking questions they hadn't asked before. Tragedy has a way of turning abstract issues into urgent self-reflection. Inside the precinct, detectives began the long process of transferring evidence, finalizing reports, and preparing for the next phase, the trial. But the mood remained subdued. There was no high-five moment, no closure. "It's like finishing a marathon you never wanted to run," one officer told me. "You crossed the line, but you're too tired to celebrate." That exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was moral. Everyone involved had spent weeks carrying a weight that doesn't disappear just because paperwork is filed. Later that evening, as I drove through Eager Street, I noticed something that struck me. The candles that had once marked the vigil for Brianna were gone, melted down to nothing. But in their place were fresh flowers, white lilies tied with a blue ribbon. Someone had taken the time to replace the remnants, to start over. It reminded me that even after devastation, renewal always tries to find its way in, however fragile it may be. That night, the city felt suspended between grief and relief. In living rooms across Baltimore, televisions flickered with the same headline. But beyond the news anchors' calm voices, there was another kind of conversation happening. Quieter, more honest. Parents wondering what kind of world their children were inheriting. Teachers thinking about students who reminded them of the suspects. Neighbors remembering the sound of laughter that used to fill the Mitchell home. The arrests had given everyone an ending to one part of the story, but the questions it raised were only beginning to unfold. When I spoke again with Detective Jameson a few days later, he looked weary but resolute. "People think the hardest part is catching the suspects," he said. "But it's not. The hardest part is realizing that justice doesn't fix what's broken. It just keeps it from spreading." His words, like so many spoken during this investigation, carried the bittersweet weight of truth. As the city braced for the upcoming trial, the focus shifted from evidence to ethics. What should accountability look like for teenagers who took a life? Can justice coexist with mercy? Can a community that has seen so much pain still believe in redemption? Those questions hung over Baltimore like the winter fog rolling in from the harbor. And as I drove home that night, past the darkened row houses and shuttered storefronts, I couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened wasn't just a crime. It was a mirror. The arrests had given us names, faces, and closure, but what they truly revealed was something deeper. The fractures in a society where pain travels faster than hope, and where every act of violence is both an ending and a beginning. By the time the trial began, Baltimore had already made up its mind, or rather, it had made up many minds. Every talk show, every social feed, every corner bar had an opinion. Some called for the harshest punishment possible. Others pleaded for compassion, arguing that no one wins when children are lost to violence, not even the victims' families. The city was tired, wounded, and divided, and in that courthouse, those fractures would be laid bare for everyone to see. I remember walking up the courthouse steps on the first day of the trial. The air outside was heavy with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and slows your breathing. Reporters had already staked their spots along the sidewalk, their cameras pointed toward the doors, lenses ready to capture grief, anger, or anything in between. People gathered in small clusters, clutching coffee cups, talking in low tones. You could feel the tension before you heard a single word. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was an emotional trial for an entire community trying to make sense of its reflection. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued but charged, like a storm waiting for release. The families sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, one side filled with quiet dignity and heartbreak, the other with anxious parents whose faces looked decades older than they were. No one came to this place whole. Justice doesn't bring healing. It just draws boundaries around loss. As proceedings began, the judge's voice was calm, measured, a steady current guiding the room through turbulent water. The defense spoke of upbringing, neglect, and systemic failure. The prosecution spoke of accountability, innocence lost, and the irreversibility of death. Both were right in their own ways, and that was what made it unbearable to listen to. Truth, in this courtroom, wasn't a single flame. It was a collection of flickers, each burning from a different corner of the same dark room. From the gallery, I watched the jurors, ordinary citizens, suddenly handed the impossible task of deciding not just guilt, but meaning. Their faces were unreadable, a blend of concentration and discomfort. They had been instructed to focus on facts, not feelings. But how can you separate the two when the evidence of suffering is sitting right in front of you? Every story told in that courtroom, every exhibit, every statement, was a fragment of human pain. And somewhere beneath the procedure, beneath the legal jargon, you could hear the echo of a single question that no one could answer. What makes justice just? Outside the courthouse, Baltimore debated that question daily. News outlets turned the trial into a mirror of national issues: youth violence, the justice system, race, poverty, punishment. Everyone wanted a simple narrative, but the truth was tangled. The suspects were victims of a system that had failed them, yet they had created victims of their own. Brianna's family had every right to demand accountability, but they were also aware of the young age of those responsible. "They're still somebody's babies," one of her relatives said softly outside the courthouse. "But they took ours." That sentence captured the entire tragedy. Two families, both broken, both right in their grief. On the second week of testimony, a social worker took the stand. Her voice trembled as she spoke about the programs that had been cut, the mentors laid off, the communities left without structure. Her words weren't an excuse. They were a diagnosis. "When we remove support," she said, "we don't remove the need. We just leave it to fester." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge paused before calling the next witness. Sometimes truth lands so heavily that it doesn't need a gavel to be felt. But for all the empathy and nuance that threaded through the trial, there was no escaping the raw core of it all. A woman was dead, and 3 children would grow up without her. Justice, in whatever form it came, had to speak for her too. I remember seeing Brianna's mother one morning, standing on the courthouse steps holding a framed photo of her daughter. She didn't speak to the cameras. She didn't need to. The picture, a young mother in her hospital scrubs, smiling into the sun, said more than any interview ever could. As the trial stretched on, fatigue set in. The city stopped arguing as loudly, as if everyone collectively realized that shouting wouldn't change the outcome. Instead, there was a quiet waiting for verdicts, for sentences, for something that might feel like closure. But closure is a myth. It's a word we invented to pretend we can seal off pain. What really happens is endurance. You learn to live beside the loss, not beyond it. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom was still. The law had spoken, carefully, precisely, as if afraid to disturb the fragile air. There were tears, of course. There always are. But what I remember most wasn't the noise of emotion. It was the silence that followed. The kind of silence that holds both relief and despair. The kind that acknowledges that no one truly wins, even when justice is served. Outside, reporters repeated the outcome like a mantra. Crowds reacted in waves, some angry, some satisfied, most simply tired. The city had demanded justice, and it had received it. But standing there, I couldn't help wondering whether what Baltimore needed more than justice was healing, something the courtroom could never provide. Justice punishes, but it doesn't rebuild. Healing takes community, patience, and time, things that don't fit neatly into a sentence or a headline. Over the following weeks, murals began appearing on walls across the city, portraits of Brianna surrounded by her children, painted by local artists. The colors were bright, almost defiant. They stood as a reminder that the story didn't end in the courtroom. It lived on in the people who refused to let tragedy be the final word. Some community groups began forming new outreach programs for at-risk youth, small but hopeful steps born from heartbreak. Out of pain sometimes, purpose begins to take shape. Looking back, the trial wasn't just about one crime. It was about what happens when a society confronts its own reflection. It exposed the fault lines we prefer to ignore, our obsession with punishment over prevention, our neglect of young minds until they fracture, our tendency to demand change without doing the hard work to make it possible. In that sense, the courtroom became less a stage for justice and more a mirror for the collective conscience of a city struggling to grow. And as the final day ended, as people filed out of the courthouse and the sun dipped behind the skyline, I realized something simple yet profound. Justice is not a moment. It's a process, one that doesn't end when the verdict is read. The real trial continues in the choices we make afterward, in how we rebuild trust, how we protect the next generation, how we ensure that no family endures this again. The city would move on, as cities always do. The headlines would fade. But for those who sat inside that courtroom, for the families, the jurors, the officers, the community, the echoes of that trial would never truly leave. Because it wasn't just Baltimore on trial, it was all of us. When the day finally came, the sky over Baltimore was the color of steel. Flat, heavy, undecided. People say weather has no meaning, but that morning it seemed to echo the mood of the city. Cold, restrained, waiting. After months of testimony and endless headlines, the story had reached the point everyone said they wanted, the conclusion. Yet walking up the courthouse steps, I couldn't shake the sense that nothing was truly concluding. Justice was arriving, yes, but peace felt miles away. Inside, the same faces filled the same benches they had filled since the first hearing. Brianna's family sat together, their hands interlocked in a circle of quiet strength. Across the aisle were the parents of the boys who had taken her life, shoulders bent beneath the invisible weight of shame and bewilderment. The air was thick with a single truth no verdict could erase. Every family in that room had lost a child. The difference was only in how. Sentencing hearings are unlike trials. Trials argue about facts. Sentencing forces everyone to sit still with the consequences. There's no cross-examination, no performance left. Only the slow, procedural rhythm of law, punctuated by the heartbeat of grief. The judge spoke in measured tones, summarizing, clarifying, building toward the final words that would shape the rest of these young men's lives. Around me, people barely breathed. It wasn't suspense. It was fatigue. The kind of exhaustion that comes after months of carrying anger like a stone in your chest. As each side addressed the court one last time, I kept watching the faces in the gallery. There were tears, yes, but also something quieter, an almost painful contemplation, because sentencing forces you to confront your own sense of fairness. How much punishment can balance a life taken? How do you measure remorse in years? How do you decide when justice becomes cruelty? Those aren't legal questions, they're moral ones, and no gavel can answer them. When the sentences were read, the words landed softly but carried the weight of mountains. Some people gasped, others simply bowed their heads. A few nodded, relieved that the long waiting was over. I remember the sound of Brianna's mother exhaling, a long, trembling breath that seemed to release months of tension. She didn't cry then, she just whispered, "Now she can rest." It wasn't triumph, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was acceptance, fragile and incomplete, but real. The boys stood motionless as the reality settled over them. Their youth made the moment surreal. They looked out at a world they would not touch again for many years, perhaps ever, and for the first time seemed to grasp the permanence of what they had done. Watching them, I felt a contradiction that's hard to admit. Sorrow for them intertwined with sorrow for their victim. It's a feeling that sits uneasily, but it's honest. Justice, when done right, isn't vengeance. It's grief organized into structure. Outside the courthouse, the city reacted in ripples. Some celebrated the decision as proof that justice could still function. Others protested, arguing that punishing children so severely would solve nothing. Radio hosts debated morality, politicians promised reform, and yet the people most affected, the families, slipped quietly back to their cars, away from the cameras. For them, the story wasn't ending. It was only moving into another lonelier chapter. That evening, I stood again on Eager Street. The porch light on Brianna's house had been replaced with a new bulb, glowing faintly in the dusk. Neighbors still left flowers now and then, though fewer each week. Children played down the block, their laughter carrying faintly through the humid air. Life, stubborn as ever, was returning. And yet beneath that ordinary noise, you could still sense the echo of everything that had happened. Justice had been delivered, but healing was still learning how to speak. What struck me most after the sentencing was how everyone talked about time. The defendants would serve time. The family had endured time. The community wanted time to move on. But time itself doesn't heal automatically. It just gives pain room to change shape. In the months ahead, Baltimore would try to turn that pain into purpose, creating mentorship programs, scholarships in Brianna's name, and youth centers meant to catch other children before they fell. These were small gestures, but they mattered. They were the city's way of refusing to let the story end in despair. Looking back now, I realize sentencing is never really about the numbers the judge reads aloud. It's about acknowledgement, an official recognition that a wrong occurred, that a life mattered, that the community was watching and would remember. And maybe that's the truest form of justice we can hope for. Not balance, but memory. Because forgetting is the only verdict that ever truly condemns us all. As the courthouse lights dimmed that night and the city settled into uneasy quiet, I thought of Brianna's children. Somewhere they were asleep, held by relatives, their dreams still fragile, but their future, hopefully guarded. The legal chapter of their mother's story was over. The human chapter, the one about resilience, forgiveness, and rebuilding, was just beginning. Months passed before the city began to breathe again. The courthouse lights dimmed, the headlines faded, and yet the story lingered like a low note beneath Baltimore's daily rhythm. Every tragedy leaves an echo. Some fade quickly, others become part of the landscape. This one settled into the city's bones. You could feel it in the cautious laughter of children walking home from school, in the way neighbors lingered a little longer on their porches, in the silence that followed each siren. The city was alive, but listening to itself in a new way. I returned to Eager Street on a bright spring morning. The trees were just beginning to bloom, soft petals scattering across the pavement like confetti from a forgotten celebration. The Mitchell house looked different now. Fresh paint, a new fence, curtains drawn halfway. It had been rented to another family, one that carried no direct memory of what had happened there. And yet, as I stood on the sidewalk, I sensed the quiet reverence people still felt when they passed. No one spoke about it openly anymore, but everyone remembered. Memory doesn't always need words. Sometimes it lives in gestures, slower footsteps, lowered voices, a glance toward a doorway once filled with life. Brianna's children were growing, each surrounded by relatives and counselors, small circles of care built from the community's collective guilt and love. I met them once, briefly, months after the sentencing. Their smiles were shy, their voices soft, but their resilience was unmistakable. Children have a way of rebuilding worlds even after the ground has split beneath them. Darnell wanted to be a doctor, like Mommy helped at the hospital. Kiara liked to draw houses, each one larger and brighter than the last. Little Marcus was too young to articulate his dreams, but he laughed easily, and in that laughter you could almost hear the echo of the mother who had taught them how. Around the city, Brianna's name had become a kind of shorthand for both grief and hope. Murals continued to appear, one near the harbor, another on the side of a rec center in East Baltimore. Her face, painted in warm tones, looked out over streets filled with life, a reminder that compassion can be revolutionary in its own quiet way. The local hospital created a scholarship in her honor for single parents pursuing nursing. Each recipient carried not just financial support, but a message. That care, even in its most ordinary form, can outlast cruelty. I spoke often with the detectives and community leaders who had lived this story from the inside. For them, the echoes were professional and personal. Detective Jameson retired not long after the trial. "You can only hold so much," he told me over coffee one morning. At some point, you realize the city's wounds are stitched with your own thread. Yet there was no bitterness in his voice, only fatigue and a kind of peace that comes when you accept that some answers will always remain unfinished. Community organizations began to take small, deliberate steps toward prevention. Youth programs reopened in neighborhoods that had gone years without them. Mentorship initiatives paired teenagers with adults who listened before lecturing. Churches hosted open discussions about trauma, anger, and the lure of digital notoriety. None of it was grand or headline-worthy. It was the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust, the kind of work that often goes unnoticed until years later, when you realize the violence has slowed, if only a little. As for me, the story changed the way I saw my city. I used to think of places like Eager Street as points on a map where tragedy had struck, fixed moments of loss. But standing there one evening as the sun dipped below the row houses, I understood something different. Every street is both fragile and resilient, shaped by the stories we choose to remember and the compassion we dare to offer. The echo of one act of violence can linger, but so can the echo of one act of love. Both travel through time. The only question is which we amplify. The psychologist who'd studied the boy's case once told me that healing is not the absence of pain, but the return of curiosity. When people start asking, "What next?" Instead of why me, that's when the future begins, she said. I saw that truth in Baltimore's slow recovery. People were asking what next? What could be done differently? How could children be reached sooner? How could kindness become as visible as cruelty online? They didn't always have answers, but the asking itself was progress. As the anniversary of Brianna's death approached, the community organized a candlelight walk rather than a vigil. The idea was to keep moving, to remember while walking forward. Hundreds joined: families, teachers, nurses, police officers, children holding lanterns that swayed gently in the night breeze. No speeches, no cameras, just footsteps and quiet reflection. It was the city's way of acknowledging both its pain and its persistence. I walked among them, listening to the rhythmic shuffle of shoes on asphalt, the soft hum of prayer songs drifting between blocks. It felt less like mourning and more like renewal. When I finally turned to leave that night, the skyline glowed faintly in the distance, the harbor lights flickering against the dark water. The city looked the same as it always had: imperfect, stubborn, alive. But I realized that stories like Brianna's change cities in ways maps can't show. They become part of the collective memory, teaching those who remain to see one another differently, to understand that behind every statistic is a heartbeat, behind every mistake a story, behind every act of cruelty a chance for redemption. The echoes of that night on Eager Street will never disappear completely. They will linger in the walls, in the murals, in the conversations whispered between parents and children when the news plays something too familiar. But those echoes can evolve. They can become reminders, not just of what was lost, but of what must be protected. In that transformation lies the faint but steady rhythm of hope. And so the story ends not with finality, but with continuation, with a city still learning, families still healing, and strangers still carrying the memory of a woman who, in her quiet way, taught us how to care for one another. That, perhaps, is the truest form of justice, not retribution, but remembrance that leads to change.